Hey, it's Professor Gould, and we're going to start off talking about genetics and heredity. And to do that, we need to first talk about what exactly are genes and make sure we understand a bunch of terms that we're going to be using as we study heredity. So first, just let's review a little bit. You remember that humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. A chromosome is a strand of DNA. Human autosomal cells are diploid, meaning they have two of each chromosome. So to note that, we use 2N. N is the number of distinct chromosomes. So the N for humans is 23. 2N is twice that, 46. Our autosomal cells have 46 chromosomes. Our sperm and egg, our N, or haploid, have just one of each chromosome. And then you remember, of course, DNA is a double helix, sugar phosphate backbone around the outside, base pairs along the inside, and those bases pair up in a very distinct way with thymine and adenine paired together, and then guanine and cysteine paired together. And this is going to be important to remember, ATCG, that's the pairing pattern, because we're going to do a bunch of this. Yeah. All right, now you remember each chromosome contains many genes, and a gene is just the instruction for making a protein. Now, there's an asterisk here because in some cases, one gene can actually make more than one protein, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. It will make sense. So each chromosome in a homologous pair, they are homologous because they have the same genes. So they might have, for example, the genes for having freckles. That might be that's on one chromosome. Now, each gene may have multiple alleles, and an allele is just a variant of a gene. Okay, so going back to our freckles, the homologous pair each has a gene for freckles, but there can be one allele that is yes freckles and one allele that is no freckles. So the two homologous pairs could either both have yes freckles alleles, one could have a yes, one could have no freckles allele, or they could both have no freckles alleles. Okay. And so here's an example of that from a monster. These are homologous chromosomes. And you can see that over here we have the brunette allele, and over here we have the blonde allele, but it's the same section of DNA, so that's the same gene. And here we have another allele for tall. This one has a short allele, but it's the same gene. Here they have, both chromosomes have the same allele for 3 eyes. Some odd-looking monster. All right, now let's look at a real-world example. Let's talk about poodles because they're adorable. And they have one gene that controls coat color, and there are 2 alleles, one that gives black coat and one that gives a brown coat. The black is what we call dominant, and we represent it with a capital B. The brown is what we call recessive, and we represent it with a lowercase b. Okay, hang on before we go any farther, because people misunderstand dominant versus recessive. A lot of time in regular speaking, when we say something is dominant, we actually mean that it's common. And that is not what we mean when we're talking about genes. Dominant means that it literally dominates over a recessive allele. So it is expressed if it is present. If you have the dominant allele for a trait, you will have that physical trait. Period. End of sentence. If you have the recessive allele for a trait, you will express that trait if you don't also have the dominant allele for the trait. Dominant alleles are always represented by a capital letter, but there are dominant alleles that are rare. Polydactyly is a condition of having extra fingers or toes. It is a dominant allele, but it is very rare in humans. If you have the dominant allele for polydactyly, you will have extra fingers and toes, even if the other allele you have is the non-polydactyly allele. Okay. Now, the recessive is only expressed in the absence of a dominant allele, and some people learned that as it's expressed if you have 2 copies of it. But I want you to think about the case of non-disjunction, where there is only 1 copy of a chromosome. In that case, that one allele could be expressed if it's recessive because there's no dominant allele to silence it. The other time that this becomes important is when something is linked to one of the sex chromosomes. If it's on the X or the Y, then it can be expressed if there's only one version of the recessive allele. If, for example, there's a trait on the X chromosome, a male who has that trait on the X chromosome, that recessive allele, is going to have that trait because they don't have another X chromosome. So they can't have a recessive and a dominant allele for that gene. Okay, so an example of that is hemophilia, which is a blood clotting disorder. It is carried on the X chromosome. It is a recessive allele, and human females, because they are XX, genetic females, XX, it are much less likely to have hemophilia because in order to have it, you have to have gotten a recessive allele from both parents. For males who have an XY, they only need one copy of the hemophilia to express the trait. All right, so that's something to keep in mind. We're going to practice these things, so don't worry, you'll get practice and it'll all make sense. All right, so there are a couple more terms we need to learn: genotype and phenotype. A genotype means the actual alleles that a person carries. The phenotype is the physical trait. So the person's genotype could be two little b's, big B, little b, or big B, big B. Or the other way we say this is homozygous recessive, meaning homo meaning same, homozygous dominant, or heterozygous. I've got that on another slide, so don't worry about those terms. Phenotype is the physical expression. So in the case of the poodles, the phenotype is brown and black. In order to have a brown coat, the poodle has to have 2 copies of the recessive allele because the black allele, the dominant allele, is simple dominant. And so even if you have one dominant allele and one recessive, it's the dominant allele that gets expressed. Okay? But that's the genotype. The genotype is which alleles you have. The phenotype is the trait. So in traits that are characterized by being this simple dominant or recessive relationship, you always know the genotype of an individual that has the recessive characteristic because, for example, to be a brown poodle, you have to have 2 copies of the recessive allele. Now, we're assuming that there was no disjunction happening. Okay, we're going to assume everyone has the normal number of chromosomes. But for the individual with the dominant phenotype, that is the black fur, you don't always know because you don't know whether they have 2 dominant alleles or 1 dominant allele and 1 recessive allele. Interesting, right? That's going to be important later. We're going to do some work with that. Okay, so we can say that a phenotype is recessive if that phenotype, meaning that physical trait, is caused by having the recessive allele. So in this case, the brown fur is the recessive phenotype. In this case, the black fur is the dominant phenotype. The big B is the dominant allele. Okay, so that's a subtle difference, but it is an important difference to know. Okay, now I'm going to stop there and I'm going to do this next part in another video. We're going to talk about what a genome is, and then we're going to talk about how exactly we get from a genotype to a phenotype.